Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on Filipino political parties. Today's episode was requested by Fan Fanatic on YouTube. If you want me to talk about another country's political parties, you can either leave a comment down below, send me an email, or put a request in the request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Colombian parties, New Zealand parties, Brazilian parties, Nigerian parties, Irish parties, Danish parties, Polish parties, Japanese parties, Greek parties, Chilean parties, and many more. So understanding Filipino political parties aren't actually super important in understanding Filipino politics. People in the Philippines, for the most part, don't really have a strong loyalty to any one party, but instead are largely seen as being loyal to political personalities and individuals. Political parties tend to be dominated by political dynasties and their allies, and the parties will often hold, at best, a shaky ideological groundwork. Party switching is common, and patronage, vote buying, and corruption are seen as important tools used to play the game of Filipino politics. So in the upcoming general election of May 9th, the big question isn't really which party will win, but rather which political figure will win. The current president, Rodrigo Duterte, is stepping down and leaving politics, which means this year's presidential election has been heavily focused on. There are several people running for president, but it seems there is a clear frontrunner, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., or as he is more commonly called, Bongbong Marcos. Bongbong, besides having the goofiest nickname of a politician I have ever heard, also is the son of the former president/dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and is dominating in opinion polls, with almost 55% of the vote, and I'd be pretty shocked if he failed to win the presidential election. I'll discuss about him later on when I'm talking about the party he's running under, the PFP. But first, let's discuss the important elections taking place on the 9th. So obviously there is the presidential election. It's a fairly simple system for electing the president. Whoever gets the most votes in the election becomes the president with no need for a majority. Uniquely, there's actually a separate election for vice president. While presidents usually have a running mate who they hope will get elected together with them, it is possible for a president and vice president to come from two rival political camps, such as what happened in 2016, when Duterte was elected as president with his rival, Leni Robredo, who was elected as vice president. There are also elections for the legislature of the Philippines. All 316 seats of the House of Representatives, the lower house, are up for election. There are two ways to get elected into the House. 253 representatives are elected via 253 electoral districts found throughout the country. Whoever gets the most votes will become that district's representative. The remaining 63 representatives are elected via proportional representation, in what are known as party list seats. However, as you will see later on, parties that contest these seats are unique, and the parties we will talk about for most of the episode don't contest these seats. Representatives will vote on rules and regulations, initiate revenue bills, and impeachment. The other legislative body, the Senate, is electing half of its 24 seats. The 12 senators up for election are elected with every voter given 12 votes, and then they are to vote for the 12 candidates that they want to get elected. Whichever 12 candidates get the most votes will get elected into the Senate. The Senate has most of the same powers as the House, and the two are considered equally as powerful. Although senators are seen as more prestigious and holding more political power, due to the fact that the Senate is a much smaller body than the House. And finally, before we begin, there's a lot of political parties in the Philippines. Many of them are small local parties that contest elections in only one or two districts, so I will largely be sticking to parties that have a significant presence in the House, and/or have a candidate in the presidential election who is polling above 5% of the vote regularly. So first we go to Partido Democrático Filipino Lakas-CMD, or Philippine Democratic Party, People's Power, or PDP-Laban. PDP-Laban is the party of Duterte, and largely grew because of him. In the 2016 election that saw Duterte get elected, the party was only able to get 3 representatives and 2 senators into office. However, in the months following the election, there was a mass exodus from other parties towards the PDP, with it quickly becoming the largest party in the country, due to politicians wanting to be in the party of the current president. It tends to be defined as somewhat on the left, and I'd certainly say a populist party. On its website, it defines itself as a party embracing theism, humanism, enlightened nationalism, democratic socialism, and a consultative and participatory democracy. Duterte last election tended to be backed by those that made more, were less likely to be Catholic, younger, more likely to be a man, likely lived in urban areas, and were more educated. The party currently has 52 representatives and 3 senators. I will talk about this later on, but the party's leadership is right now disputed, with President Duterte leading one faction of the party, and boxer and current Senator Manny Pacquiao leading another faction. PDP-Laban's website talks about some sort of vague promises about fighting to remove poverty and corruption, and improving the livelihood of all Filipinos. Duterte, while in office, has promoted a very tough-on-crime approach to drug dealers and communist and Islamic insurgents in the country, along with also building up the country's infrastructure and try to expand healthcare and affordable college to more people in the country. The PDP and Duterte have also tended to try to promote pro-federalist policies, wants to move away from America while not being necessarily hostile towards it, and has tried to promote business-friendly policies. Duterte, while he has been a fairly popular president with a fairly high approval rating, is not controversy-free. Duterte's tough-on-crime policies are believed to have resulted in the deaths of thousands to even 30,000 people, with his opponents and human rights groups claiming a lot of those dead were just innocent civilians. Duterte is also accused of just being a demagogue, corrupt, and an incompetent administrator, like a lot of populist politicians tend to be accused of. In terms of problems for the party, well, as I mentioned earlier, there's a schism going on right now in the party. Pre-2021, Duterte and Pacquiao were fairly close political allies, but starting in March of 2021, the two began clashing, with the two forming their own rival wings of the party and having endorsed separate candidates for the presidential election. Duterte's faction endorses Bongbong Marcos, while Pacquiao's faction endorses Pacquiao, who is running under a different political party we will talk about later on. Regardless of which faction ultimately wins, the party will probably lose influence, as many politicians will leave the party that got them elected to join whichever party the president is from, and since many of its current members are people who switched in 2016, it's unlikely many will remain loyal. Next we go to the Nacionalista Party, or Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party is the oldest party in the country, being formed back in 1907, when the Philippines was an American colony fighting for greater autonomy and independence. After independence in the 40s, the Philippines entered into a de facto two-party system, with the Nationalist Party serving as the country's right-wing political party. During the Marcos dictatorship, it disappeared before being reformed in the 90s and the 2000s. I've seen the party labeled as conservative, nationalistic, and populist, but really it's just a party for the Villars and Quitanos political dynasties. In the 2010 presidential election, the party's candidate got most support in the Ilocos region and in the south. It currently has 44 representatives, 4 senators, and is endorsing Bongbong Marcos for this election. It is currently headed by Manny Villar, a senator and former representative. Now normally I would try to say something about what the party believes in, but I quite frankly don't see any actual policies from the party. If you go to their website, it is literally just a 2-sentence description of the party and then their contact info. Like, it's nothing. And yet despite this, they are still one of the strongest parties in the Philippines, since they have the money to get their members elected into office, and most of its members will just ally with whatever party is running the country. The only real policy I think I can say for them is they oppose their old-time rivals, the Liberal Party of the Philippines, and tend to work in coalitions or endorse candidates against them. That's really all I can say for them. And we will move on to the next party, the Nationalist People's Coalition, or NPC. The NPC was formed as a break-off of the Nationalist Party, and occupies a similar, sort of conservative, sort of populist, sort of nothing political ideology. It has served as an ally of Duterte while he was in power. It has 39 representatives, 3 senators, and its leader and current senator and party leader, Tito Soto, is running as a vice presidential candidate, with him polling around roughly 17% of the vote. Soto is running his campaign with Panfilo Lacson, who has in recent months been losing ground in opinion polls for the presidential race, and failed to secure the official endorsement of any parties, partially due to opposition rallying around other candidates, and the fact that Lacson allegedly killed a journalist in the 2000s. Lacson and Soto are running their campaigns largely trying to present themselves as the middle ground between Duterte's administration and his critics. They are running as law and order candidates who want to crack down on crime and corruption, although without a lot of the populist rhetoric around Duterte. They also seemingly want to get tougher on China, want more funds to go towards rural governments, and want to prioritize Filipino industries. We go to another national party, with the National Unity Party, or NUP. The NUP is, again, another party with a hazy ideology, although it seems to lean more into Christian democratic ideas. It has since Duterte's election served as an ally of the president. It currently has 36 representatives, and has endorsed Bongbong for president. It is currently headed by Elpidio Brazaga Jr., a representative, and former mayor of Dasmariñas. In the party's constitution, it, quote, acknowledges God as a supreme being. It also talks about ensuring national sovereignty and respecting democracy, fighting for social justice and equal opportunity for all Filipinos, and wants to promote environmentally friendly policies. Next we go to Lakas Christian Muslim Democrats, or lakas-CMD. Lakas-CMD was formed as an interesting combination of Christian Democrats and Islamic Democrats, and describes itself as trying to uphold a humanist message. It has served as an ally of Duterte, and the daughter of Duterte, Sara Duterte, is running as a vice presidential candidate, hoping to get elected with Bongbong Marcos. Also, funnily enough, her father isn't endorsing her, and it seems like she and her father have had a lot of beef over the years. In the 2010 presidential election, the party's candidate was most successful on the island of Mindanao, and on some islands north of it. It currently has 24 representatives and 1 senator. The party is headed by Martin Romualdez, a representative. Lakas-CMD on its website talks about fighting against corruption, decentralizing the country, and ensuring children are taught the importance of Christianity and Islam in developing the Philippines. It also talks about promoting affirmative action, ensuring the Philippines is a place where a business-friendly environment can thrive, wants to further digitize the economy, and wants the Philippines to become more self-sufficient, but also is fairly vague on its website, and doesn't really specify or clarify on what it means by any of this. So the past couple of parties I've been pretty vague on, which I'm sure is probably a little frustrating, but this next party I hope there will be a bit more to talk about. The Liberal Party is, as you would suspect, defined often as a liberal party. However, the Liberals are also a well-established party in Filipino politics, and also described as broadly conservative and non-ideological, and is seen as a party for the Rojas and Aquinos political dynasties. It was originally founded in the 40s after independence, and served with the Nationalist Party as the 2 dominant parties in the Philippines. It, after the Marcos dictatorship, and especially in the early 2010s, was a very powerful political party, but after the 2016 election, many of its members defected to PDP-Laban, and it serves as the sort of opposition to Duterte. In the 2016 election, it got most support among poorer Filipinos, those in the center of the country, and had more support among Catholics and women. It currently has 12 representatives, 3 senators, and the current vice president, Robredo, will technically run as an independent for president, but she will have de facto party support and is polling at around 20% of the vote. The party's leader and a current senator, Francis Pangilinan, is running as a vice presidential candidate. The Liberals are seen as representing obviously liberal ideals, such as freedom of expression, freedom of choice, and the social liberal idea of freedom from poverty. Robredo has run her campaign around being the opposite of Duterte, and of offering a new vision of Filipino politics. She opposes the violent crackdown on drugs Duterte has carried out, and opposes federalism, while also supporting Duterte's plan to expand infrastructure throughout the country. She has promised to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination, and is in favor of same-sex unions, although she opposes legal marriage, opposes legalizing divorce, wants a tougher policy towards China in the South China Sea, and wants to do more to rise people up out of poverty. While this is a lot more of an actual concrete platform than some of the other parties we have talked about, it still is, quite frankly, lacking in a lot of ways, with the party's website only mentioning vague platitudes and not really going into how they will carry out their goals. The fact of the matter is, the Liberal Party is, just like many of the other parties we have talked about, willing to engage in patronage, vote buying, and corruption in order to get ahead. I suspect this is part of the reason that Robredo is trailing so far behind Bongbong Marcos, since many may see her and her party as being just as corrupt and hollow as the current government, but also willing to get rid of some of the government's measures that are more popular with the general public. It also seems Robredo is being looked at by Duterte and Bongbong Marcos supporters as upholding the traditional post-1986 way of doing politics, which for many has been characterized as a failure to help ordinary people in the Philippines and uncaring to concerns about crime or poverty. It seems online a lot of Robredo supporters are claiming that polls in the country are inflating the Bongbong Marcos vote, so we'll have to see what happens. But I doubt the Liberals will return to their former dominance after this election. So those were the biggest parties in the House and the Senate, and we'll start looking at the other parties who have notable presidential candidates. We'll first look at Partido Federal ng Filipinas, or the Federal Party of the Philippines, or PFP. The PFP was formed recently in 2019, from allies of Duterte, but the party itself had, and has today, no real power at the federal level. However, in 2021, It was announced that, as mentioned earlier, Bongbong Marcos was going to be the party's presidential candidate, and he quickly shot up in the polls, becoming very popular among Duterte's supporters, although there actually is a faction within the PFP that supports Robredo. Overall, if Marcos wins the election, we can likely expect politicians from other parties to flock to this new party, and the PFP to become the new most powerful party in the country. It is currently headed by Reynaldo Tamayo Jr., the governor of South Cotabato Province, and the former mayor of Tupi. Bongbong Marcos has run his campaign on both continuing many of the populist measures that Duterte is carrying out, along with also promising to return to the glory days of his father's rule. He has promised to improve the country's infrastructure, to kickstart the economy by investing more in business, continuing a non-confrontational foreign policy towards China, and keeping law and order policies to prevent crime and terrorism. He also is seemingly slightly socially progressive, stating that he's open to signing laws legalizing abortion and divorce in some circumstances, and allowing same-sex unions. The PFP also is broadly a party in favor of federalism and greater rights to local regions. Bongbong Marcos' relation to his father is probably the most controversial aspect of his campaign. His father had ruled the Philippines from 1965 to 1986, and just about everything about him is controversial to a certain degree. He imposed martial law in order to crack down on a communist insurgency, with opposition forces banned, and a disputed number of several thousand being killed and or tortured. Ferdinand Marcos and his wife are believed to have been corrupt, taking state funds to live out an extravagant lifestyle, with the family's current wealth being mostly funds stolen from ordinary Filipinos. And yet, despite all this, you can still find a lot of positive support towards Ferdinand Marcos, due to the fact that for most of his reign, the economy grew, infrastructure improved, and crime went down. There seems to be an effort by Bongbong Marcos and his supporters to present a much more positive image of the Ferdinand Marcos years, which has led to accusations that Bongbong Marcos and his supporters are engaging in historical revisionism. Also, funnily enough, opponents of the Marcos family are often accused of being American puppets, despite the fact that the American government helped prop up Ferdinand Marcos during his reign. Next we go to Aksyon Demokratiko, or Democratic Action. Aksyon is a fairly small, liberal-ish populist party that first became active in the 90s before largely disappearing in the mid-2000s. Starting in 2016, it re-emerged and is gaining a bit more influence. However, I wouldn't say they are a major party. The only real reason I am talking about them right now is because its presidential candidate, current party leader and mayor of Manila, Isko Moreno, is polling around 8%, with most criticism centering on people viewing him as being inexperienced. While Moreno will probably be the third most voted for candidate, I doubt his party will gain a lot of ground in the legislative election. Also, just a fun fact, Moreno was an actor before he entered politics, and in the late 90s he starred in several films that appear based on IMDb descriptions as softcore pornos. The party currently has 2 representatives. Moreno has campaigned largely on the idea that he will institute smart governance reforms. He wants to invest more in disaster-proof housing, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and sustainable tourism. He has argued the government needs to be simplified, and while mayor has sought to do more to clean up Manila, often going on Facebook to showcase his efforts in cleaning up the city. He also is in favor of continuing the war on drugs started by Duterte, although opposed to some of the more extreme measures, is in favor of same-sex unions, and believes divorce should be legal. So the last party with a significant presidential candidate we will talk about is Probinsya Muna Development Initiative, or Progressive Movement for the Devolution of Initiatives, or PROMDI. PROMDI is a small political party that, as the name suggests, is in favor of further devolution for the Philippines, wanting less power in Manila, and wants power to instead be spread throughout the country. It is currently backing Pacquiao's campaign for the president. The party was largely dead pre-2021, but was revived in 2021 with Pacquiao joining the party a couple months after it was revived. It is said that the party in Pacquiao is largely made up of fans of Pacquiao's boxing, and it seems most people have kind of dismissed it outright. Pacquiao is polling at just a little over 5% of the vote. Pacquiao is the party's one and only senator. Pacquiao has run his campaign largely on being a social conservative. He opposes gay marriage, divorce and abortion, and is pro-death penalty. He is critical of Duterte's current stance towards China, wanting a more aggressive foreign policy, and PROMDI, when it was revived, actually called for the Philippines to obtain nuclear weapons. He also wants to crack down on corruption, wants to build more free housing, and wants to lower electric rates in the country. So those are all the parties I will go in depth in, I briefly want to talk about the parties that contest the party list seats in the House. As mentioned earlier, these seats aren't contested by the previous parties we have spent all episode with. Instead, small parties that are supposed to represent either marginalized or underrepresented communities are the only parties that are supposed to participate. For example, one party contesting elections this year is the Toda Party, that is supposed to represent tricycle drivers. Another party currently in the House is supposed to represent senior citizens, while another is supposed to represent construction workers. Since the election threshold is quite low, a lot of parties are actually able to get a seat, with 51 parties electing at least one candidate in the 2019 election. The three most voted for parties in 2019 were the Anti-Crime and Terrorism Community Involvement and Support Party list, which won a grand total of 9% of the vote. Bayan Munya, a leftist party that is supposed to represent the working class and got 4% of the vote, and the Ako Bicol Political Party, which is supposed to represent people living in the Bicol region, and got 3% of the vote. It seems the many parties that contest the party list seats are often accused of either being puppets for the government, not actually representing the groups they're supposed to, or, alternatively, puppets for the NDA, a communist insurgent group wanting to overthrow the Filipino government. So that will conclude this episode on Filipino politics. The main thing to take away is that Filipino politics is not really based around parties at all. It's better to think about individual politicians and their relation to other politicians, with individual relations to political parties being more of an afterthought. If you want to learn more, I will recommend Eurasia Review. They released a article, Why Do Political Parties Not Work in the Philippines? Election Analysis. And that kind of goes over a bit of the history of Filipino party politics. And then it also just kind of explains really what I've been saying, that political parties don't really matter in the Philippines. So yeah, I hope all of you enjoyed. I hope if you are from the Philippines, you vote on the 9th for a government or whoever works for you. Up next, I'll talk about Colombian political parties, and we'll learn about the presidential election that is happening there. And then I'll talk about the history of Burundi, and then I'll talk about New Zealand political parties. I know the Colombian political parties episode should come out before the 29th, but whether it'll be like the 20th or the 28th, I don't really know. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries exist for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.